Great, thanks. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Living Seas Live. I hope you're all well on this very sunny evening. We're here discussing topics that we think will be really interesting to you, projects that we're working on at the Wildlife Trusts, and of course, highlighting challenges and issues that we feel are really important at a time when there's so much going on and we really need to take care of our wildlife and our natural environment. So we're happy to welcome so many of you this evening. Great to have you with us. As I'm sure those of you that have attended before will know, my name's Bex Lynham. I'm the Marine Advocacy Officer for the North Sea Wildlife Trusts, and I'm assisted by my colleague Anna. Give us a wave, Anna. Anna Cowie, who works for Yorkshire Wildlife Trust as our Marine Pollution Officer, and Anna's the mastermind behind the talks. She does all the tech side of things for us. And talking of tech, hopefully we won't have any issues this evening, but of course, if we drop out for a couple of minutes, just bear with us and we'll get things up and running as quickly as we can. If we don't come back, then we've had a major issue. We will record this talk and make it available to you all later down the line. As always, please add your questions in the chat function at any point throughout the talk. Keep them coming to us, and we'll make sure that we give those to our speaker. So we're going to be hearing this evening about shellfish fisheries in the North Sea. Our speaker this evening is Mike Roach from the Holderness Fishing Industry Group, HFIG, which is based in Bridlington on the east coast of Yorkshire. Mike's been working in this role as a fisheries scientist for the last 8 years and works very closely, as you would expect, with lots and lots of different fishermen and women across the region. Also joining us this evening is James Woods, the Fisheries and Research Manager for the North Sea Wildlife Trusts as well. James manages our fisheries projects alongside some of the restoration projects that are happening in the area. In regards to seagrass and oysters. He's been with the Trust for 4 years and came to the Trust from one of the inshore fisheries and conservation authorities as their Principal Environment Officer. So lots and lots of experience, and he's got a PhD in lobsters as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to talk to us for around 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to have a chat between the three of us. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for logging in to come and listen to me talk. So, as Beck said, my name's Mike. I work for a fishers organisation based in Bridlington, the Holderness Fishing Industry Group. A little bit of an unusual fishers organisation. I'll discuss a bit more in depth further in the presentation. I'm going to talk to you about the coastal crustacean fisheries along the east coast, bordering the North Sea. So a quick introduction. I'm going to very quickly outline the crustacean fisheries we have, what makes a productive fishery, both from the biological and the fisheries management perspective. Then I'm going to focus down into where we are in the Holderness on the east coast, an example of both the Holderness fishery itself and how an industry group can work towards the sustainable management of our own stocks. So many people visit the coast for lots of reasons. Predominantly, most people like to walk along the harbour, get the fish and chips and an ice cream. Those harbours are intrinsically linked to the fishing communities along our coast, and they can be from a small cove like Flamborough North Landing on the east coast in Yorkshire here, or more traditional fishing ports such as Whitby that has large tourism industry, or places such as Cromer and Sheringham down in Norfolk. So the tourism side of life is intrinsically linked to those coastal fishing communities.
Mike, sorry to stop you. I can't see your presentation. Can you just share your screen with us?
Apologies.
That's okay. Just might not have come through. So just try again, and I will let you know that we can see it.
With me 1 second. This has happened plenty of times on Zoom. It's a problem with technology, isn't it? So let's try it again.
There we go. Yep, that's great. So just put it in slideshow
There we go.
mode. Perfect, thank you.
We got that one.
We have.
Apologies for that one. So obviously that's me, who I am and where we are. So this is all our social media tags and things like that. So please follow us and find out more about what we're up to. I just quickly went through the introduction there. That's what I'm going to be covering. And so I was talking about fishing coves like North Landing, which is the image on the left here in Yorkshire, and larger ports such as Bridlington, Whitby, Scarborough, Cromer down in Norfolk. These are all incredibly important coastal fishing communities. So I'm talking about the crustacean fisheries. So the type of fisheries we have, I've just focused on the North Sea boundary, so the east coast of England. The species we get, the European lobster, brown crab. We also have a velvet swimming crab fishery. We've got the langoustines or scampi, and brown shrimp and prawn fisheries. And all in together, it's over 11,000 tonnes landed last year. And this equates to about 21% of all species landed. That's about a fifth. And that's worth to those coastal communities over £32 million. However, it's only a fifth of the overall fish species landed, but it represents over 60% of the value of the catch. It shows how incredibly important those crustacean fisheries are from an economic perspective. So, for example, in Bridlington, where we are, the first sale value of the catch is around about £9 million, and that's what a fisher gets. So that's what the fisher gets at first sale value. And it's estimated to contribute to the local economy by approximately £20 million. For every fisher at sea, there's 4 to 7 working ashore. And don't forget, a lot of these coastal communities are in relatively deprived areas, or can be in deprived areas. So the importance of fisheries is very relevant. So there was a lot of talk in the Brexit debate of fisheries only being 0.5 or 1% of GDP. However, the importance to these local communities is a lot more than that single figure that was bandied around in the news. But we can see there's a wide range of fisheries targeted. But what makes a productive fishery? So we start with a stock. We need a strong spawning stock biomass. So that basically means that the stock itself is large enough and productive enough, so the spawning stock, to be able to sustain any kind of fishing effort to it. So basically those reproductive males, those reproductive females, if we have a strong spawning stock biomass, it is indicative of a good fishery. Consistent recruitment into the fishery. So what that means is we're looking for the smaller species, younger species, having plenty of opportunities to grow up, breed before entering the fishery. And then we look at the fisheries management side, and we want to ensure that fisheries work towards sustainable harvesting. So they're not taking out too many of the breeders, basically, to affect that spawning stock biomass. And then we've got the environmental factors such as habitat availability, those key environmental conditions, so the water's just right, not too warm, not too cold. There needs to be plenty of food around, and those habitats and species residing in them have limited disturbance or interactions. And this can be from predator-prey interactions, or it can be through fishing exploitation or marine developments, such as gas exploration, offshore wind farms, gas pipelines. So for an example, in our small area last year, we saw 7 different developments all undergoing at the same time in a 32-mile stretch of coast. And these all have some kind of effect. These are the kind of things that we spend a lot of our time dealing with. So just to come back onto those habitats as examples we have in the North Sea. such vast, different, complex habitats, ranging from sandbanks suitable for sand eels on the Dogger Bank, about 70 miles off Scarborough. We have a very complex habitat, the cobble around the Holderness where we are, which is perfect for lobsters and crabs and your shrimp species because they generate lots of shelters for shelter-dwelling organisms. Off Hartlepool, there's silty mud beds that are ideal habitats for the scampi species, the langoustine, because they need a certain consistency of silt to mud in order to be able to build their burrows. And that's why because we have these diverse habitats, we have such a diverse species assemblage in the North Sea. So I'm going to focus down a little bit on Holderness fishery where we are. So we're based in Bridlington as an organisation, but the fishery stretches from Flamborough Head to the north to Sperm Point to the south, and that's just on the mouth of the River Humber, leading up to Grimsby and Hull. Traditionally an inshore fishery for the lobster and crab. However, it now extends out way beyond 50 to 70 miles. So the Holderness fishery was traditionally, like many coastal ports, a whitefish fishery. Right up until the late 80s, early 90s, the fishery target whitefish such as haddock, cod, whiting, and that's a red line you can see in the two graphs, in graphs A and B there. Mid-90s, we saw a switch over. So the blue line in the graph on the left is your lobster landings, and the blue line in the graph on the right is your crab landings. And you could see that there was a complete diversification in the fleet away from whitefish, targeting shellfish. The reason they coincide together is they're both targeted in the same method, using static gear, so gear that doesn't get trawled along the seabed. It is a pot that's baited, put down on the seabed, and is a passive fishing tool to attract the animals into the pot. So where we are at the minute, we have extensive landings of lobster and crabs. So Bridlington is the key port in the Holderness, and that represents the largest amount of lobsters landed in the entire of Europe. So the Yorkshire coast as a whole, when you go from Whitby to Scarborough down to Bridlington, represents the greatest proportion of lobsters landed in Europe. And it's the same with the crab, although crab is a lot more widely dispersed and you have extensive fisheries around the coast of the UK. But last year we landed 328 tonnes of lobster. This is down from its peak in 2017, which was 457 tonnes. However, that was a new management regime was introduced where it's now illegal to land an egg-bearing female. So that had reduced the proportion of the catch by about a third. Crab species has been affected by the Chinese market expanding and subsequently closing. So that's been affected recently with that. But from the bar graphs on the right, you can see that the crab in the black, the price per tonne, so the value in pounds per tonne, has remained fairly stable across the year, whereas lobsters is very seasonal. And this is a combination of market factors and supply and demand. So in the winter, certainly around Christmas time, there's a high continental demand for lobsters for Christmas dinner on the continent, for example. Whereas the weather's bad, it's hard to get to sea. So there's low supply, high demand, and that drives prices. Over summer, those prices tend to drop. But it's still a very lucrative fishery. So in comparison, lobsters, 310 tonne worth, about £4.5 to £5 million. The crab species is around 2,000 to 2,600 tonnes, worth about £4.5 to £5 million. So they're worth the same amount, but one is more than 4 times the value of the other. So who we are as HFIC, I forgot to put that picture in. We're a very different kind of fisheries organisation. We have 3 employed members of staff. So you've got myself as the offshore scientist, fisheries scientist, and you have Jamie as our managing director on the left there. And then you have John, who's our relatively new, facility manager, and I'll discuss that facility shortly. And just as a word of warning, if you ever end up coming to see, if you fall asleep on deck, that picture is exactly what happened. So we have 3 members of staff that are responsible to the board of directors, and we have a steering committee, and these are made up of key influencers and stakeholders within the fishery. So we've got the fish merchants, or landing companies as we refer to them. We have representatives from the harbour in Bridlington, but also the smaller ports at Withernsea and Hornsea that are beach launch vessels. So these are vessels launched off the beach using a tractor. We have representatives from the inshore and offshore fleet and outside academics as well. And all this information gets fed to our membership. So the work we do, we spend a lot of our time fisheries advocacy and representation. So we sit on advisory panels to help advise management measures for our stocks and our fishery. And we do extensive fisheries liaison. If I had the time, probably 3 hours, I can show you the spatial conflict that is currently going on in the North Sea with the expansion of offshore wind energy, vast areas needed for such. Gas exploration is still going on, aggregate exploitation, and we've also got the fisheries, apologies, not fisheries, but marine conservation areas. So we have marine conservation zones, specially protected areas, marine protected areas. We also have a no-take zone in our fishery. These are all things that need liaison between all stakeholders. We enjoy outreach and education. This talk, for example, we do extensive work with other fisheries in relation to our coexistence plans with the offshore wind sector, and we love going into local schools or getting them to come down to the harbour to tell them about the fishery that is right on their doorstep. We also do academic research. That's where we come in. We have been focusing on the effect of a wind farm on a key lobster population that was raised back in 2013 prior to the wind farm was being constructed. And this was a first of its kind project. It was a collaborative project between the fishing industry and the offshore wind farm developer. Ordinarily, this would go to a commercial consultancy to do an impact assessment or a monitoring project. Instead, we've been working with Ørsted, the UK's largest wind farm developer, to understand what the effects of the wind farm are on our lobster population. This spanned 6 years, 4 intensive sampling regimes. We were at sea twice a week for 4 months, measuring everything. So we recorded nearly 100,000 animals during this work. And we also do consultancy work alongside, because we have a research program within the fishery, both to understand subjects or issues such as the effects of a wind farm on a population, but also to understand the factors affecting stock recruitment and stock assessment. And unfortunately, research costs money, so we have a consultancy on the side that helps fund all these things. So this, to my knowledge, is the only research vessel in the UK owned and operated by the fishing industry. She's a 10.8 metre catamaran based in Bridlington. She doesn't hold a fishing licence, so everything we catch we record and throw back. And this was an initiative taken by the members to get ahead of the curve. And this is what I mean by a fishery actively engaging in their future. To understand what is happening in the marine environment, they agreed to purchase the research vessel with the aid of European funding and other funding bodies to understand some of the issues they're facing. So we conduct potting surveys. We try and get them done annually. We also do static netting surveys, trying to understand the fish assemblages in the area. As you can see the image on the bottom left, that's our main role to date, is looking at the effect of this wind farm. It's been such a long study. But we also have an internship program where we take students from our local university, So we've had them from the University of York and the University of Hull. One, to get experience of at-sea research, which is a difficult thing for students to get a chance to do, but also how to learn to be on a vessel and work at sea in those unsociable hours. We also do assisted teaching with the University of Hull, where their oceanography module, their students will come and learn how to deploy oceanographic tools. And this is a program we've been doing for quite a few years. And you can see, we discuss all things with the local schools, whether it's fisheries or that's me pretending to be a diver from a book that we're learning. It's all about that engagement to a wider audience. So that's our interest. Last year, we finished building the Yorkshire Marine Research Centre. So this is our new facility. This is based on a quayside in Bridlington, and it is a state-of-the-art research facility where we are interested in all aspects, whether it's environmental, oceanographic, or biological effects on our stock and the species of concern we're there. It's a community laboratory. It's got the laboratory component, but it also has an experimental lobster hatchery. So this isn't like your normal lobster hatchery where you try and generate lots and lots of larvae, see them through their cycle. So they have 4 larval stages and then they molt into post larvae, where they settle onto the seabed and become true lobster. And then hatcheries then release those into the wild. And the reason being for this is it reduces the chance of predation if you can release them out of size, where they can basically adopt what we call a cryptic lifestyle and hide straight away until they grow to a size where they're a bit safer. We're more interested in the research component behind it. So we are concerned about subjects such as ocean acidification, plastic pollution. Will these things affect the larval stages of our lobsters? And we're also interested in developing hatchery technologies that can help other hatcheries around the UK. So like I said, this is brand new. We opened it in September last year. We managed to what we call close the cycle. That's taking a buried lobster, like you can see the picture there, putting it in our system. Those eggs will hatch. They'll hatch naturally, and we'll keep the larvae in these containers you can see in the middle picture there. And they'll progress through their molt cycles until we then put them into what we call a hive system once they're a post larvae. So they're a true lobster at that stage. So all of these things are driven by the fishing industry. So like I said right at the beginning, we're a bit of an unusual fisheries organisation. We have fishing industry employed scientists, both myself and John, who's an oceanographer by trade. And this is our industry trying to get ahead of the curve, get involved in their own agenda, and also try and break down the barriers between fishers and scientists and policymakers that have existed for a long time. It's a very short presentation. I can talk for hours, but I need to leave some time for James. So thank you all for listening. Again, this is all our information. We've got a new website. The final thing I'll say, if you're interested a bit more about the wind farm, that link, the YouTube link there, or just search fishing into the wind farm. That was a video that we made with Orsted last year. So it could give you a bit more insight into what we've been up to. But thank you for listening.
Fab. Thank you so much, Mike. That was a really fascinating talk. So I've got so many questions. For such a small organisation, you're doing a huge amount, and some really fascinating topics for conversation there, as indicated by the number of questions we've got coming through. So I'm just going to ask you quickly to stop sharing your screen and ask James to come back on screen, because we all want to see you. And I'll start off the questions. So Now, I'm thinking you've probably been expecting this one. Of course, it's been a really hot topic in the last year or so, or for a number of years now. And what people really want to know, understandably, is how Brexit has affected the industry, and it will do going forwards. I wonder if you could give us your perspective on that.
So, as I alluded to in my talk, the fishing industry were heavily involved in the Brexit debate. But it's a very complicated issue. So you've got the catching sector that were wanted access restricted for foreign vessels in UK waters, whereas you've got fisheries like ours, where nearly 90% of everything that is landed is exported to the European Union. So over the last 12 months, it has been difficult. The barriers, rather the bureaucratic barriers that have been put in place due to paperwork have caused issues. But some of our merchants were very ahead of the curve, got themselves sorted, and have still carried on exporting. But we did see one of our long-standing merchants end up shutting up shop. The Barron Shellfish had to close their business because they relied solely on the export market, and it became very difficult. The fishers themselves, it was a very turbulent time because as Brexit hit, so did COVID. And specifically with lobsters, it's a live export. Restaurants shut down. Trade became difficult. And last year was a very difficult year for the fishery. And hopefully we're starting to see some bounce back now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very clear that it has been an extremely turbulent time. There's been a huge amount of pressure on fishers. So I guess I wonder, are there any wins for your members? Are there any wins from Brexit? And also, what can people do to support local sustainable fisheries?
So the fantastic thing is, British people started eating British fish. But one, because it could access it because it wasn't being exported. So we saw certainly locally, people selling their catch direct to the public, not in vast quantities that they would do for the export market, but it certainly helped their businesses. But there was also a drive for the public to engage with the species that we have in the UK here, move away from the cod and chips that everybody likes, and start exploring the wonderful seafood we have. So you can see it down on the south coast where they're rebranding the spider crab species because no one likes the idea of it being called a spider crab. So now it's a Cornish king crab. And these are all great initiatives. So the best thing we can do is where you can buy local, do so. Don't be scared of trying to cook things. Certainly crustaceans, they are very difficult, but there's fantastic resources on YouTube. Seafish do some wonderful videos on how to prepare and cook the seafood. And just try and support your industry where you can. Give it a go, because you never know, you might like it and keep doing it.
Absolutely. So quite a simple message there, Mike. Choose local, choose different things, try something new, and a bit of clever marketing in there by companies as well. So James, I don't want to move away from that question too quickly, but I just wonder, obviously fisheries is a very complex area. What from your perspective are the opportunities that Brexit presents our fishing sector? Obviously we're now not going to be part of the common fisheries policy. So where can there be improvements be made?
I think just stepping back a second and to look at that Brexit question as well. There was a change in the scale of business as to how that affected them. And really that's where we've seen the winners and losers come out of this. And I think that's going to lead onto what you've just asked there, because a lot of the businesses that we've been working with, if they collected catch for export from a number of ports, or they had what we call a part load, that was the sector that was really heavily affected, because they had to have a set of paperwork for every single catch that they collected from up and down the coast. So some of the big providers and some of the big exporters, where maybe they collected catch from 5 or 6 ports, suddenly found that they had several £100s worth of costs added to each haulage load. Whereas merchants who were exporting from a single source, say Bridlington, actually did a really good job of navigating that paperwork. And in terms of looking at this future landscape there, as Mike was saying, the British public has become a lot more approachable to some of these fish species. And a lot of the work that we did in that period during COVID and Brexit was helping a lot of those fishermen to set up and get the paperwork in place. We helped a few of them get funding for things like refrigerated vehicles so they could do local delivery. We helped with signposting to local fish merchants. And actually, some of those businesses which we were worried about folding or were really struggling at some points actually saw a real increase in business. So I think one of the areas that we can see a win in is people going back to their local fishmonger, people buying local again, having a local delivery supply, which is a lot stronger, and also having that local message there. A lot of your existing fish merchants in the area or fish deliveries in the area were coming from national companies, and there's no provenance there. You don't know where your fish has come from. It might be collected in Grimsby but sold in Scarborough. Whereas actually one of the opportunities we've seen is people marketing it as this was caught in Scarborough and landed in Scarborough this morning and sold in Scarborough this afternoon has been a real selling point and real strength for people to be able to pitch against. So I think that local provenance message has allowed people to really build a new type of business that we weren't seeing much appetite for before.
Fab, thank you, James. So Dawn's asking, moving away from Brexit, Dawn's asking a question about the graphs that you showed in your presentation, Mike. There was those two graphs showing whitefish landings versus shellfish. And she wonders what prompted the move from whitefish to crustaceans in the mid-1990s. Was that about the availability of whitefish declining? What was the reason for that switch?
So again, that's quite a loaded question. And there's lots and various factors that affected that switch. One was, as you've alluded to there, stock decline in whitefish. It happened. We can't move away from that. There was also entering into the common fisheries policy, and it was a mass decommissioning scheme. I think it was like back in the 80s, £53 million the UK government put into a decommissioning scheme. So that saw a reduction in the whitefish sector as well. And then there was the price point issue. So there was an emerging market for your lobsters, for your crabs, which wasn't as prevalent back then, so 35 years ago. So that emerging market, if you can make more, if you're putting in a day at sea and you can make more money catching lobsters than you can cod, then as a businessman you would do so. And that's what we often forget, is fishers are businessmen, and often incredibly successful ones. Fuel prices, like I said, the decommissioning scheme, management regimes were a key driver. Because the stocks saw decline, heavy management had to come in. So in order for a fisher to maintain a living, they had to diversify. And it's not just a case of going getting a job ashore. A lot of fishers are generations in the fishing industry. So it's a way of life for them. So they looked for a way to continue their way of life. And that meant switching to a different method of fishing and species that were targeted.
Absolutely, thank you. James, is there anything that you want to add on to that in terms of the impacts on the white fisheries?
I think the other thing that just needs adding in there is that we have seen a climatic shift across the whole North Sea. In my experience, 20 years ago, you would never see a sea bass being caught in the area. Now you can't get away from them. They're everywhere. And actually your cod catches are absolutely minimal and they're a lot smaller. And we are seeing, stocks move 20, 30 kilometers north each year. And I never thought I'd see a bonito tuna get caught in Bridlington Bay, and it's a regular occurrence. I had somebody who was showing me photos of red mullet the other day that they'd caught in one of their nets. So we do need to acknowledge that whilst overfishing was a key driver here as well, we are seeing a systems change. And this is why you're seeing reports of, bluefin tuna occurring off the south coast. So, it can be a consequence of factors like that as well as overfishing.
Great, thanks, James. Just given what you've just both been talking about in regards to Brexit, just so going back a step, we've got a question that saying that, you know, the short-term problems are clear for the industry. Do you, in the longer term, see negotiations simplifying that paperwork, getting our waters reclassified as suitable for live exports? What are your thoughts on that?
I'll jump in there first, Mike. I think in terms of seeing our waters reclassified, there is minimal aquaculture in the North Sea area at the moment, which would fall into that high profile news at the moment. We don't have the offshore mussel farms. We only have a couple of oyster farms in the area that would affect. I think it's really beyond our scope to kind of influence those international negotiations or see how that's going to go. I mean, every fisherman we speak to has their own suggestions as to how that should proceed and how that can be achieved. I think from a North Sea Trust perspective, we just want to ensure that, you know, stocks are managed sustainably and managed appropriately, and that actually we don't end up in the situation where people are drawing lines in the sand and being militant and overfishing as a political tool.
Sure, thank you. So, putting Brexit to one side then, what do you see, Mike, as the biggest threats or pressures to the Holderness fishery at the moment?
The overarching pressure to any fishery, as James said, is a climate change issue. Really, in a basin like the North Sea, the tracking northward of species will affect any fishery. So James mentioned the red mullet in nets. We've been catching red mullet in lobster pots during our surveys, only sort of 3-4 inches, but the fact they're here says a lot. So as an example, on the eastern seaboard of the US, their southernmost lobster fisheries are collapsing, not through overfishing, but because the ocean temperatures are too warm for the tolerances of the animals, so those animals are tracking northwards. So the fisheries to the north are doing well, but the southernmost fisheries aren't. And that, to my mind, is the biggest issue we need to deal with. There are lots of other issues, such as the trade, the capabilities of fishers to fish in an ever-competing marine environment. So, for example, the wind farm industry, we've been working very closely with them, but the Hornsea Zone project off the Holderness coast has a bigger spatial footprint than the City of London. When you look at those kind of issues, these are all pressures on coastal communities and fisheries. So there's some work that shows that coastal communities that rely on fisheries are the most vulnerable when it comes to changes, whether it's climate driven or external pressure driven. So it's something we do need to keep an eye on moving forward.
Absolutely, and it's such a complex picture, isn't it? As you mentioned, the biggest pressure on the fishery, or one of them, is climate change. Therefore, we need those wind farms, which also present a pressure to the industry as well. And of course, you know, they're taking up more and more space in the North Sea. But just generally speaking, the North Sea is a really busy place. It's becoming very industrialised. There's, you know, huge competition for that space, and the cumulative impact on all of our wildlife, including our shellfish fisheries, is just growing all of the time, isn't it? So it's that, how do we manage all of those needs that we have against, you know, keeping our seas and those stocks healthy? James, is there anything that you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, so I think Mike's covered a couple of the key ones there, but one of the main issues that I see as well, and this is a national, not just North Sea, is actually displacement, and that's both from a fisheries perspective and other offshore users' perspective. So if we take 2013, for example, scallop dredging was closed in 3 other areas of the UK. And we went from having a very small 5, 6 dredge fishery off Scarborough, which was operated by seasonal vessels who potted part of the year, trawled part of the year, and then scallop dredged part of the year. And within 3 months, we had over 50 vessels operating in that area. And we ended up going from those artisanal scale 10, 12 meter boats to having 25, 30 meter boats and the industrial fishery off there. So there is a consequence here which isn't really being addressed in UK management at the moment, where we are introducing spatial management in some areas and not dealing with the consequence of displacing that fishery or the latent overcapacity. So we do need to look at that. And the other example would be where Mike's talking about Dogger Bank. Because we've had conservation areas introduced off the Holderness, there's now a core focus from those offshore wind farms to bring their pipelines and bring their cable corridors into North Yorkshire, because it's easier to bring them in that route where there aren't those protected areas than it is to bring them into the Holderness. So we've gone from seeing the Holderness being an area of focused offshore development to now seeing a massive focus in North Yorkshire. And again, the North Yorkshire fleet are not used to those impacts. And actually, because of national drivers, we're seeing 5, 6, 7 projects all concentrated in a 5-year period coming through and having a really big impact in that area. So I think displacement is one of those offshore areas which just isn't picked up by any singular regulator at the moment, but it's becoming an increasing problem as there's competition for space.
Fab, thank you, James. And staying on the theme of wind farms, they're a very popular topic. We get questions about wind farms on every single talk, and no wonder. We're going to be getting a lot more north wind in the North Sea. We need it. We need to make our energy sources sustainable, but that means a significant increase in offshore wind capacity in future years. And because we've had a lot of questions about this topic, we are going to put a talk on about offshore wind in the North Sea later this year, because it's definitely something that we want to talk about. It's really important that we meet our climate commitments, but ensure that we balance that against our commitments to protecting biodiversity as well. But we've got a couple of questions that have come through specifically about them. So one from Jan is around the effects of wind farms on the lobster population. So Mike, obviously talked about your work in that respect. So you can answer that one. And also Dawn asks simply, can you fish amongst the wind farms? Is that possible?
So I'll answer the second question first because it's easier. Yes, depending on your gear type and the location of the wind farm. So our work has been on the westernmost rough wind farm just off Tunstall here in the Holderness, and the orientation of the turbine array is conducive to allow fishing inside. And the spacing between turbines allows fishing. The tidal conditions make it suitable to be able to fish in that wind farm. There are no legislations in the UK to say you cannot fish in a wind farm, whether the fisher chooses to. Bearing in mind, we have static gear, so strings of lobster pots that stay on the seabed, don't move. We moved 10 miles down the coast to the Humber Gateway wind farm, and we survey in there as well. And it's a very different site to work. So you go from 35 turbines in a 35 square kilometre area to 73 turbines in the same spatial footprint. You have the influence of the Humber estuary, so tidal conditions are a lot stronger. The space between the turbines is nearly half of what it is at the westernmost rough. And it's a very difficult wind farm to work in. There is a move with wind farm developers to make allowances with future developments to move towards coexistence. So if for example, in France, we hosted a delegate of French fishermen to come and look at ours, and their developers was looking at making it possible to dredge their wind farms, so their orientation of their inter-turbine cables and things like that. So yes, you can. However, it's not always easy. So around each turbine is a advisory safety zone of 50 meters. That's to make sure that it's just a safe distance away. However, if there is construction going on, so for example, they need to do a blade repair or sort of replacement, it's a mandatory 500-metre exclusion area. And that's where coexistence plans come in, where we work in disseminating that kind of information. So yes, you can fish, but not everybody does. So that static gear, mobile gear, is very, very few people that will trawl in a wind farm. And that is a risk perception of the business owner or the skipper. I don't have any experience in that, so I'll just leave that one there. With regards to the lobster population, we've seen annual variations in the size structure. So we measured the size of all animals and the catch rates and landing statistics from such. So we measured everything that came up, recorded everything, but we also looked at the condition of the lobsters so we could work out, based on that lobster, would a fisherman land it? So we can look at the landings per unit effort as well as a catch. So without an hour's presentation, in a nutshell, we didn't see annual variation, but we had, within each year, we had a site in the wind farm, one to the north acting as a control, and the same across the export cable where the power is sent to shore, and another site to the north of that acting as a control. And between the controls and the site, the treatment sites, either the turbine array or the export cable, we saw very little significant differences between the two, and that's either in catch rates or in the size structure. The only exception was during the construction phase. So the area was closed to fishing during the construction phase for safety reasons. However, we were still surveying during part of the construction phase. So what we noticed was the area actually acted as a no-take zone. So we saw an increase in landings and catch, so big quality lobsters. So basically they weren't being removed by the commercial fishery. So we were catching them all, measuring them and chucking them back. So during the construction phase, we expected everything to disappear from the area, and it didn't. Certainly the lobster and crabs that we recorded weren't affected to a large extent. It was more of a removal of fish and exploitation altered those results. But for a scientist, it's very hard to say, oh, we didn't find anything. But in a nutshell, that's kind of it. We saw more lobsters as the years have progressed, but that's those differences in sites haven't been seen annually.
Thank you, Mike. That's really interesting. So just changing tack a little bit then, I'm wondering, thinking about our position as a conservation charity and yourselves as obviously representing the fishing industry, where can we work together as organisations to improve the situation for all? It's obviously we all want more fish in the sea. We need the environment to be sustainably managed. What are the things that we can do? What tools might we use as fisheries managers and conservationists to improve the sustainability of the fishery and the wider natural environment?
So it's incredibly important to maintain the viability of both the fishing industry as an economic entity, but also the environment, and two, the stocks that live in that environment. So we have this suite of areas that have different levels of legislation, and it's working out what methods are compatible to different regimes. So, for example, static gear fisheries in high densities have been found to have an effect on the habitats and the environments they're deployed in. However, these are very high densities, whereas the vast majority of static gear fisheries around the UK are fairly low density. When you look at number of pots per hectare or kilometre squared, I think education is one of those key aspects, both like today, talking to the general public, but also between sectors, engaging further with the different sectors is a key aspect as well.
Fab, thank you. And James, is there anything that you want to add in on what we can do working together and with, you know, other stakeholders as well, of course, to improve the situation?
Well, I think we've seen a change in the past couple of years in terms of the level of dialogue between people. And in fact, actually, no, to be fair, that goes back to about 2010 with the change in underpinning legislation there. I do always say that sustainable fisheries and the sustainable fishing industry are two separate things and need to be approached in a different manner. And I think, as Mike said in his opening, the importance of local fisheries to local rural communities cannot be understated. You know, most of these places, either every family has a tie to the fishing industry in some way, or, you know, if we look at some of the communities, Scarborough, Bridlington, Hornsea, etc., you know, there is generally a family member who is linked to the fishing industry. Most of those families, the fisher is the predominant earner in those households, and actually it's got a massive economic influence throughout those sort of small towns and communities. So I think a lot of the work that we've done and a lot of the links there in terms of cooperating with people are, we need to fully understand the influence of that fishing industry and the wider impact it has, and take that into account when people are advocating for management or proposing changes. Marine socioeconomics has only been a key emergent area in UK fisheries in the past 10 years. It was really a hindsight when people were introducing management before that. So I think having that economic review and having that consideration has been a key thing that's come through and is still developing, and is an area that all of us need to input into and support.
Fab. Thank you, James. And so linked to that question, Dawn asks Mike how stable the lobster and the crab populations are at present, and perhaps you want to touch on the sustainability of that fishery, and maybe answer the question around whether there should be limits on shellfish populations. There are limits on how much you can catch of other species. Should there be one for the shellfish industry?
So I'll just try and separate shellfish and crustacean because they're two very different things. So shellfish incorporates everything, including scallops and mussels and things like that. But when we look at a crustacean fishery, they're currently legislated for a minimum landing size. So that is normally set at a size to ensure every animal has a chance to reproduce at least once prior to being able to be caught. For different fisheries, there's different sizes based on the biological parameters of those stocks. However, there is a need for management. The trick with potting fisheries is getting that management right. So we're working very closely with DEFRA and the MMO and other organisations on panels such as the Shellfish Industry Advisory Group and the subsequent crab management group from those, where it's industry and policymakers and stock assessors such as CFAS all working together to try and come up with an adequate management plan. And this is happening right now to try and get it right. Because what we don't want to see is issues like we saw with vast discards due to quota limitations in the whitefish sector. You want to learn from the mistakes of the past and get it right now. Under the new fisheries management plan that we now fall under as an independent coastal state, there are mechanisms in place for us to do this. However, this organisation has all been up and running a year. It takes a long time to set any policy in place, unfortunately. So we are working towards it in a minute, whether that involves restricting effort, setting a quota or total allowable catch. These are all management, they're all tools in a management toolbox that have to be investigated. And they have to be investigated, taking into account, like James said, the social and economic factors as well. Because yes, we can manage the fisheries perfectly, stop everybody fishing, but you've ruined the livelihood of everybody. And those coastal communities are really so we're working towards it. And there is a drive within DEFRA and the policymakers to get this right as well. Hopefully, we're looking at a 5-year plan at the minute, but we're hoping it's going to work a little bit quicker.
Thanks, Mike. Anything that you want to add to that at all, James?
When we're talking about sustainability and when we're talking about stable fisheries, the UK's been in a really strange place. England's been in a really strange place for a few years, where we have these nominal boundaries for management. So you've got the 6 mile and the 12 mile and then the EZ. And we've seen IFCAs come through. So inshore fisheries and conservation authorities came through in 2009, 2010 into existence. And they've been able to introduce local management and really strong management measures relatively quickly compared to other legislation.
And can I just add in there, James, when we talk about that management agency, we're talking about managing out to the 6 nautical mile line, that inshore sector only, aren't we? Sorry, carry on.
So you've kind of got really strong management and quick management, which has been introduced to that 6 mile boundary. And then outside of that, there's been an inability to introduce anything which has been regional or anything which has been rapidly responded to. So we're actually in the situation in England at the moment where we can have really good management for the part of a fishery that's inside 6 miles, but then hardly any regulation for the rest of that stock that's outside of 6 miles. And there's a number of cases where if that management was spread throughout a stock, that fishery would be sustainable and it would be a fair fishery across the board. But at the present, it's not. And we've got this really divergent management to nominal boundaries that actually mean nothing to any fish species or fish stocks whatsoever. So one of the hopes going forward is that will be redressed and we can start to look at managing fisheries better on a stock by stock basis. And that's part of what Mike was referring to there. I mean, talking about the Holderness fishery, you've seen this massive expansion over the past 30, 40 years where this shellfish stock has come through, and you've had a complementary fishery come through with it. And one of the problems that we've got there is that the management hasn't kept pace and the science hasn't kept pace. And if you look at the budget that's available for doing those stock assessments to work out if something is sustainable, it's parts of a percent. And actually, half the fisheries in the UK, which may be sustainable or could be sustainable, fall down and we can't claim as sustainable simply because we don't have the money there and haven't had the budget there to do this long-term monitoring and stock assessments to work out and get the science right. So sustainable is not a term that I often try to use. I mean, if you've had a fishery which has been under fishing pressure and fished for 40 years and it's still expanding and it's still stable and we've still got stable or increasing amount of pots in there, that should give people a fairly good indication of the health of that stock and its current condition.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think that point about investment in research, etc., is one that we would extend more widely than just information on stocks, isn't it? On fish stocks, that applies to the natural environment per se. That we need to see that investment in understanding our natural environment being made. But I think I'll stop us there. It's a shame we've only got an hour because it's an absolutely fascinating topic. It's also a really complex topic, from the different types of fisheries, the scales of different fisheries. We could be here all evening. So I'll stop us there. But what I will say, though, is if people still have questions that they would like answered, please do send them to us. We do want to answer them. We've just simply run out of time. So I think, we've heard that there's no silver bullet in regards to sustainable fisheries, but together we're working on that. Sustainable use of our seas and sustainable fisheries, we absolutely need those for our natural environment and for our coastal communities. There's a range of different management tools that can be used to achieve this. But there's no one size fits all, and it might be appropriate to put in national measures versus local or regional measures or other. But I think what I'd like to emphasise overall is the need and the desire to collaborate between organisations, ourselves as NGOs, as fishing industry groups, and many others, to share that huge wealth and knowledge that fishermen have, and make sure that we can do the best for our seas and our fish stocks going forward. So I'd just like to thank everyone who's been listening in. Thank you for all of your questions. We've had lots of questions, which is fantastic. That's what we want. And of course, we hope that you'll join us again for our next talk. And that next talk will be on Wednesday, the 19th of May. We'll email you with the link and the notification and the reminder, of course. And we're going to be hearing from Dave O'Hara from the RSPB. He's going to talk to us about the state of puffins. And the impact that our activities are having on them and what we can do about it, essentially. If you have very specific questions, you already know them, that you want to send us, then you can do so in advance. But of course, if you simply want to tune in on May 19th and ask them via the chat function as you've done this evening, then please do so. As always, send in your feedback and your thoughts, your comments to us. We always want to hear them. And of course, your suggestions for topics that you might like to hear about. We'd like to hear those as well. I'll say good night. Thanks again for joining us. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you again in a month's time.